Southern Alaska is facing the worst oil pollution disaster in American history. An emergency cleanup operation has been going on all day after a fully laden supertanker hit a reef.
On the 24th of March 1989, one of the world's largest supertankers ran aground on Bligh Reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound. The tanker, Exxon Valdez, was carrying 50 million gallons of crude oil.
We fetched up on the ground, evidently we get some oil.
Just past midnight on March 24th, the supertanker Exxon Valdez crashed into a reef off the coast of southern Alaska.
One of America's most magnificent waterways is blackened and befouled tonight by the biggest oil spill in American history.
240,000 barrels, 11 million gallons of Alaskan crude oil escaped from the huge vessel.
The oil industry's response plans had promised a swift cleanup in the event of a spill.
Seven hours after it struck Bligh Reef, the toxic slick from Exxon Valdez was already 2 miles long and 4 miles wide. The tanker's single-skin hull had been ripped apart.
I ran out to the airport and the fisherman said, report back, tell us what you see. You know, we're talking happily because it's Cordova. We go, we fly out Orca Inlet, we come around Knoll's Head, and conversation to stop. I mean, here is this incredible scene. The sun is just starting to come up. It's an amazing scene. And black calm down on the water surface with this blood red tanker in a black inky stain. And above it is cloud, bluish. And we're flying along, and all of a sudden we're into this smoke. It was like instant headache, instant nausea. And so we flew up above it, and then we just circled and circled and circled. We're 9 hours after the wreck, and there was not a speck of promised recovery equipment on the water. This had all been promised within 6 hours, and we were 3 hours past 6 hours, and nothing.
10 hours into the spill, with the water's flat calm, conditions were ideal for a recovery operation. But the Alyeska Consortium's oil cleanup equipment was nowhere to be seen. Not only was the Alyeska team late, it could never have coped with the spillage on this scale. Already 11 million gallons of oil were fouling the waters of the Sound. Oil executives, the world's media, and the governor of Alaska were all descending on the scene of the disaster.
The evidence is that the response was slow and inadequate. I think that's...
With the Alyeska cleanup team still nowhere in sight, the governor arrived to find Exxon, the tanker's owners, had taken charge. And they had a plan of their own.
Exxon began limited tests of chemical dispersants to try to break up the oil. The dispersants were controversial, and it was unclear if they would work or cause even more harm.
The chemicals that you use to cause the oil to sink is very dangerous to marine life, and we have to be certain that we cause a minimal amount of damage.
Dispersants, it's an aid to the natural weathering process of oil in water.
It was Al Mackey. He worked for Exxon, and he's just telling everybody that this is the miracle cure.
The dispersants will not be effective at all. After the majority of the spill is cleaned up off the water, and it looks like there's no more oil around, the oil can be down in the water column, and the fisheries resources can still be affected weeks after the spill looks like it was cleaned up.
These dispersants are not the miracle cure, and they do increase the toxicity of the dispersed oil.
It turns out Exxon had not prepared to use dispersants. They didn't have enough in stock, And to disperse a spill of this size, there weren't even enough in the country.
By mid-afternoon, the oil was slowly spreading, covering over 20 miles of prime fishing waters. Alieski's response team finally arrived. 13 hours late, and only with enough equipment to collect 10,000 gallons. Nowhere near enough to recover their own cleanup target of 8 million gallons.
Nobody really knew what to do. The whole idea was to start pumping the oil off, but we never did that. And we just said, why don't they just abandon this tanker and call the Air Force in and just burn it?
Three days into the spill, and only 2,000 gallons of oil had been recovered. With whole communities dependent on the fishing industry, local anger boiled over into public rows with Exxon.
That's what I want to know, because you think I flew 2:30 this afternoon, there wasn't even a Kleenex in the water to clean up that oil.
You have had some good luck, and you don't realize it.
You don't have anything to clean it up.
You have Exxon, and we do business straight. We will consider whatever it takes to keep you whole.
Within 2 hours of the meeting came the local community's worst nightmare, a Force 10 storm.
In Alaska, the state governor has declared a state of emergency. 70-mile-an-hour winds are foiling attempts to clean up the massive oil spill. It is now stretched to cover an area of at least 40 miles.
President Bush sent me up there as the Commandant of the Coast Guard to run this oil spill cleanup. We overflew the area, and a winter storm had come through, and it had blown the oil completely all over the sound. The seas had beat against the islands and thrown up the surf, and the oil was 6 and 8 feet up into the tree line.
One of our great failings was waiting for official people to tell us what to do. It was a big mistake. If we had not waited, but just used our own native wit and sagacity and gone out in the field with this fleet of vessels right at the outset, which is what we really wanted to do, we could have formed basically a bucket brigade and scooped up a whole lot of oil.
The fishermen finally decided to take matters into their own hands. Their task? To save 117 million newly hatched salmon from oil contamination. The hatching farms for breeding pink salmon were now directly in the path of the advancing oil.
The oil slick has ruined 800 miles of beaches, and now there's a threat to fisheries further down the coast.
The key hatchery was at Sawmill Bay. The fishermen desperately needed booms, underwater fences, barriers to keep out the lethal oil.
Folk, this stuff floats. Go out there and open the doors and kick it out. It's night. They hear the big helicopters flying out there, and then all of a sudden they hear this stuff hitting the water. Pop, 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 pop. And plastic containers the size of desks are falling out of the sky down there around these fishing boats. No one had to tell them what to do.
There was a lot of important people showed up. I remember them debating, where to put these booms, and by the time they tried figuring out a place to put it, we already had it hooked up on a different spot where we knew where it should go.
The captain of the Exxon...
The salmon fry rescue operation was a success, but other wildlife would not be so lucky. 500,000 seabirds, 3,000 otters. Over half the wildlife in Prince William Sound would perish.
The huge oil slick is continuing to grow. It now covers more than 1,600 square miles.
If you can imagine the chaos that went along with Pearl Harbor being attacked and people doing what they could, it was hard to think big enough.
The spill would devastate one of the world's most beautiful environments and the communities that depended upon it.
Alaska is facing an ecological disaster. Thousands of seabirds are dying in the slick, which also threatens rare sea otters, seals, whales, and salmon.
Neither Exxon nor Alyeska, the oil pipeline company in charge of the immediate response, was ready for such a large spill.
Alyeska was supposed to have an emergency response team at its terminal in Valdez, but 8 years ago the team was disbanded.
The response vessels were either under snow or being repaired. They were completely overwhelmed. Coast Guard didn't quite know what to do.
Equipment to fight this spill has to be flown in from as far away as Texas and England.
Exxon says it's using all available resources, but it argues the spill is simply too big to surround with booms and skim it up.
As images of the spill appeared on the evening news,
growing questions about how future disasters of this kind can be prevented and why there was such a slow response to this spill.
At the same time, another storyline was also taking hold.
The Exxon spokesperson says there might have been a problem with Captain Hazelwood. It seems he had a bit of a drinking problem.
Good evening. The captain was drinking. The captain has been fired. That is the sum of it from Alaska tonight.
The story became Hazelwood.
Top 10 excuses of the Exxon tanker captain. Number 10 was trying to scrape ice off reef for margarita.
That's a sensational kind of story. You have an immediate assignment of responsibility, an immediate villain. What was lost in all of that was the company's responsibility.
When a pipeline to bring oil from northern Alaska to Valdez was approved in 1973, the oil industry and the federal government promised to make safety a priority.
The Alaska pipeline's on its way. The environment will be saved.
The government initially supported double-hulled tankers and a high-tech navigation system in Valdez.
We were given blanket assurances about safety and spills. In retrospect, I erred in not making sure that what was said was not put in writing.
Those promises never materialized, and when the state of Alaska passed its own safety law, the oil industry sued, saying the law infringed on federal authority.
The court threw out the state's plan, so no double-hulled tankers, much more freedom to determine where the navigation channel would be.
When the pipeline first opened, tankers were closely monitored by the Coast Guard and stayed in the shipping lanes even when they were clogged with ice floes.
Instead of diverting out of the channel, they were supposed to slow down.
But by the time the Exxon Valdez left port, the Coast Guard routinely allowed ships to leave the channel to avoid the increasing amount of ice.
Slowing down was not something they want to do because time is money.
Judging by our radar, I will probably divert from the TSS and end up inbound lane if there's no conflicting traffic. Over.
A few minutes after that message, the Coast Guard wasn't monitoring the Valdez on its radar.
The Coast Guard is supposed to be the check in case the ship makes a mistake, and they weren't watching the ship.
Captain Hazelwood turned the bridge over to third mate Gregory Cousins and went to his quarters after giving instructions to maneuver around the ice.
Did you have any concerns about getting past the ice?
Not at that time, not at that instant, no.
Cousins continued going south, heading directly into Bly Reef.
A federal investigation later found that Cousins lost track of the ship's location and didn't turn back in time. It found that reduced tanker crews probably left Cousins overworked and tired, contributing to the accident, a conclusion Cousins and Exxon disputed. The investigation faulted Hazelwood for leaving the bridge and said his judgment was impaired by alcohol. Hazelwood denied he was drunk and was later acquitted of criminal charges related to drinking.
Did they have some fault? Yes. But the real fault was there wasn't the safety net.
Exxon spent more than $2 billion cleaning up the spill and says there was no long-term environmental damage.
For a community like Chinega Bay, which had been in that area of Prince William Sound for 10,000 years, for the first time in their history, they were afraid of their own food supply and what their future held. This was more than a big deal for those communities. This was a challenge to how their way of life could continue.
Images of dead wildlife were beamed across the world. Their impact was instant. There were protests, boycotts of Exxon petrol stations, and thousands of Exxon credit cards were returned or destroyed. 1,000 miles of the Sound's coastline was now contaminated with oil.
I was out on an island that had about 6 inches of oil on top of the cobblestone, and out there was a Eskimo woman, and she was oil from head to foot. They were trying to wipe up the oil with rags. She had oil in her hair, she had oil in her, all over her slickers. It was cold. It was raining, half snowing, and the wind was blowing. And I came across her and I said, "Ma'am, what are you doing out on this island some 30 miles from civilization?" She looked at me and she said, "Admiral, this is my land." This is my land. And when she said that, you know, at that point, if it became just a job, it suddenly became a mission.
Getting the oil out of the water had been a failure. The task now was to get it off the beaches. Under the gaze of the world, Exxon accelerated its cleanup operation.
We accumulated all of the available boom in the free world. We brought in enough boom to go around Manhattan Island 3 times. To be able to put people out on those shorelines, we had to build hotel ships. There are no hotels out there. There's no place to live.
It was quite something. I mean, if you're just interested in bringing machines into remote places, it was quite impressive because they had high-pressure hydraulic systems, hot water, big nozzles, and they would direct the water at the beach, and in some cases several going on at once.
As the days went by, the cleaning intensified. 6 weeks into the spill, Exxon had hundreds of workers on the beaches.
You spent anywhere from 8 to 12 hours on the beach spraying. And they'd rotate. People would rotate. And there would always had to be someone behind you to help you because the power of the water was really forceful.
As the cleanup continued, Exxon also now turned to the local fishermen for help.
They had no vessels, so they had to hire local fishing vessels to try to do a spill response. There was also a public relations component to that, certainly. But they had to get vessels out there with booms and skimmers to try to mount a spill response. So they hired a lot of vessels to do that at very, very high charter rates.
But the sudden influx of money into a now devastated fishing community had unforeseen consequences.
Some people prospered, like profiteers in war. Some people became Exxon whores. Other people were purer than pure. It was really a great opportunity to make a shitload of money. People were toasting, Joe Hazelwood in the bars in Valdez. They were making more money than they ever saw before in their life. It was a time to really get rich. You could really profit off this thing. I mean, you just cannot believe how bad it was for those of us who really give a shit.
June. By now, 11,000 workers were cleaning the heavily soiled beaches, but the manner of the cleaning was becoming a source of conflict.
It was horrible. The steam, the hot water, wiped out everything that had survived the initial oiling. So the clams, the mussels, the sea kelps, and left bare rock. Tide would come in, more black oil. Have to steam clean it again. But meanwhile, there's no life on these beaches at all.
My feeling is, whatever you killed, there's plenty more of it right down here, and it's going to come back. If you don't remove the oil, nature is going to eventually remove it, but it's going to look bad for a long time, and the publicity is going to be horrible. You kill some little critters in the process, you couldn't possibly kill them all, so they're going to repropagate.
The huge oil slick left by the crippled ship is continuing to grow. It now covers an area nearly twice the size of mainland Britain, and it's causing even more damage to the ecology of the area than was at first feared.
I had some 45 vessels out in the field, 250 people collecting wildlife, birds, and otters. I got a phone call, have your fleet quit collecting otters because you're not authorized. It was a terrible moment.
You have to have a special license and so on. And the folks that managed them basically told people they couldn't touch them. Well, you couldn't stop people from touching them. And they're dying. Yet fishermen who were shooting them the day before the spill are now collecting them, trying to protect them. And when you ask the fishermen about it, said, you know, these otters didn't do anything to anybody. We have to do what we can to save our resource. And so they went from shooting them to picking them up. And it was something you couldn't stop.
Among many of Exxon's workers, there was now a growing unease, not simply with the methods, but with the cleanup itself.
We all knew what was going on. The only thing they did was made a good show because people were on the beach, they were spraying, and if you looked at that, you thought, oh, wow, they're really cleaning those beaches. But it was pointless. It was just show. When they collected the oil, there was never a lot in the containers. And I would look and I would see that, and I'd think, oh my goodness, it's just a waste.
The tanker which caused the Alaskan oil spill has been refloated. As the Exxon Valdez was freed from the reef in Prince William Sound, a New York judge set bail at $1 million for the tanker's former captain. Joseph Hazelwood is accused of drunkenness and recklessness.
Captain Joseph Hazelwood would later have his drunkenness charge dropped. He admitted drinking, but hadn't been breathalyzed in time. Found criminally negligent for the spill, he was fined and sentenced to 1,000 hours of community service, sweeping the streets of Alaska.
Fishermen in Prince William Sound have filed lawsuits against the owners of the tanker and the Alaska Environment Department. They're accused of gross negligence.
Exxon, too, would be criminally convicted over the spillage. But the case that would grab the headlines centered on the communities of Prince William Sound.
Essentially, when the oil hit the water, it not only contaminated the entire environment, but it shut down entirely all commercial fishing and other commercial activities dependent on the water.
35,000 people's livelihoods were affected. In a landmark case, they sued Exxon.
Exxon at the time wanted people to sign waivers, basically releasing Exxon from further financial liability if they accepted Exxon's meager payout that year. And Exxon was saying, take it or leave it. If you leave it, we'll see you in court.
My trial team consisted essentially of 12 lawyers and probably 20 paralegals. During the summer of the trial, Exxon had 200 lawyers here in Anchorage. So I always thought we had them outnumbered. Our charge was that they knowingly and consciously allowed a drunk to drink on the job the night of March 23rd, March 24th, and as a result of his drunkenness, he ran his tanker up on the rocks on a reef that had been charted by Captain Cook and had been on the charts over 200 years. So it's not like this was a hidden rock pile. It had a light on it.
In September 1991, 3 summers after the spill, Exxon declared the beaches safe. 25% of the oil had evaporated, and of the rest, the company felt it had removed what it could. But doubts still remain about the scale of the cleanup.
There still exists long-term environmental damage in Prince William Sound. After 3 summers of $2 billion worth of work, 13,000 workers, 1,000 vessels, 100 aircraft, they recovered maybe 5% of what was spilled. So, pretty ineffective.
Pockets of oil remain beneath the surface of some beaches more than 2 decades later.
Prince William Sound is not the same as it was. The environment still has not fully recovered, and we're over 2 decades into this now.
Exxon paid $300 million to those hurt by the spill, and a jury later awarded another $5 billion in punitive damages. Exxon appealed, delaying the case for 14 years and leaving lasting bitterness in Alaska.
4,000 of the original plaintiffs have died since the Exxon Valdez.
In 2008, the Supreme Court cut punitive damages to 1/10 of the original amount.
The community is still very depressed.
Fishermen like Mike Weber say the local economy never recovered.
500 people left. That's a lot in a small community. I'll never recover from the oil spill.
After the spill, Exxon became an industry leader in safety, and millions of federal dollars were designated for cleanup research. Congress required better contingency planning, double-hull tankers, and tugboat escorts in Prince William Sound.
We were now making traffic out of Valdez probably the safest line of passage anywhere in the globe.
Wildlife is gradually returning. The otters and the salmon have recovered. But the killer whales face extinction here, and the herring fishery, once the great lifeline of Prince William Sound, remains closed.
But the accident also exposed the inattention to oil industry safety and led to promises to repair the damage that had been done.
We will consider whatever it takes to keep you whole.
And to do more to stop future spills.
We also rededicate ourselves to transportation safety and to realistic planning for accidents that do occur.
Nearly 25 years later, what happened to the promises made in the wake of the Exxon Valdez?
The explosion happened at the Deepwater Horizon rig Tuesday night.
Now everyone's hoping and praying that the Gulf of Mexico rig doesn't turn into an environmental disaster.
We're going to fight it subsea, on the surface, and on the shore.
The Gulf spill might already be as much as 3 times worse than the Exxon Valdez disaster.
After the BP oil spill, a presidential commission found that many lessons of the Exxon Valdez had been forgotten in the pursuit of offshore oil drilling.
I used the phrase that the offense got way ahead of the defense. The potential risks had increased dramatically, but there'd been no commensurate increase in our capability to avoid an accident or to respond to it.
It found that the major oil companies had made only a minimal investment in new response technology, and the government spent less than half the authorized amount on cleanup research.
The emphasis is always on preventing these things from occurring, because when they happen, we're not very well equipped to deal with them.
The news was again filled with the struggle to contain a massive spill, using much of the same crude cleanup technology used 20 years earlier.
We're still relying on booms, still relying on skimmers, still relying on shovels.
And response plans that were again unrealistic.
Lawmakers are alarmed that BP's competitors have given the government nearly identical emergency response plans. Those plans include steps to protect wildlife that does not even live in the Gulf.
And the government authorized BP to use nearly 2 million gallons of dispersants, though many of the same questions were still unanswered.
The key question that scientists are trying to figure out is whether oil dispersants in the deep ocean do more harm than good.
The commission also found that while tanker safety improved after Valdez, the oil industry resisted new offshore drilling safety rules.
It was reflective of a culture in the offshore oil industry. We ended up 20 years after Exxon Valdez with an even more serious incident, but no better prepared to avoid it or deal with it.
The other oil companies, including Exxon, have denied that a systemic problem exists.
We would not have drilled the well the way they did.
3 years after the spill, new commitments have once again been made to improve spill prevention and response.
3 years out from Exxon Valdez, there was still a deep commitment to applying the lessons that had been learned. 10 years out, that commitment had substantially eroded. If you come back in the year 2020 and ask, what have we learned? Are we safer? I think we'll know whether we really learned the lesson of Exxon Valdez.
Alaska, America's last frontier, the largest state in the Union. Vast, remote, and unbearably cold. Only the Klondike Gold Rush disturbed its peace as one of the world's great wildernesses, with one area more revered than any other, Prince William Sound.
Prince William Sound is arguably the finest marine ecosystem in North America. At the very northern end of the coastal rainforest, it's a wildly profligate place of fish and marine mammals and bird life. And even people who have grown up there all their lives are not humdrum about the place.
Men and machines have come here. They've come to what could be the new Klondike. But this time, the gold's the liquid variety, crude oil, which British Petroleum has struck here on the north slope of Alaska.
It was the largest oil field ever discovered in North America. Estimates, billions of barrels. Oil companies BP, Exxon, and Arco discovered a new gold mine.
4 years, the pipes been piled up here waiting for the politicians to make up their minds to decide what to do with them. It took a fuel price to force that decision.
The Yom Kippur War made getting Alaska's oil to market a matter of political urgency.
Because of that war, most of the Middle Eastern oil producers have reduced overall production and cut off their shipments of oil to the United States.
An amendment proposed by Alaska's Senator Mike Gravel led to the solution, and President Nixon signed off the pipeline.
Alaska Pipeline's on its way. The environment will be saved, right? No problem. Mark, you're an environmentalist, right?
Right.
You have no problems on the pipeline?
No great problems.
No great problems. That's a way of saying there could be.
And so began the engineering epic of building the 800 miles of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, from the Arctic Circle's Prudhoe Bay to the port town of Valdez, at the head of Prince William Sound.
The construction of it just took 3 years and $9 billion to build it. The oil companies just threw money at it to get it done as rapidly as possible because they didn't care.
The arrival of the pipeline in Valdez in 1977 brought untold riches to the oil companies who built it and to the people of Alaska. Inuit for Alaska was the name chosen by the oil companies for the consortium they set up to run their Valdez operations. Filling 2 tankers a day, Alyeska would transport 2.5 billion barrels of oil a year to mainland America. If anything went wrong, it was the Alyeska consortium's job to put it right. By the early 80s, there had been enough low-level incidents to alarm the fishing communities of Prince William Sound. Their biggest fears concentrated on the Alyeska Consortium's ability to deal with a major oil spill. By the mid-80s, the Valdez terminal was shipping out 20% of America's oil, $100 million worth every day. Alaska had become an oil state with the Alyeska Consortium the dominant power. By the late 80s, Dan Lorne had become alarmed by the Alyeska Consortium's cutbacks on its environmental safeguards and the failure of the state to regulate them.
I wrote a memo in December of '84 talking about how everything's being gutted, and at the end of it I'd say our failure to act on this is basically a signal to the oil industry that the state of Alaska no longer cares.
It operated 12 years without a catastrophic spill. And so there's sort of this dismissive attitude that, well, if there's a 0.1% probability of something happening, should you attend to that? If 99.9% of all these tankers are going to go out just fine, why should we focus on the potential for a catastrophe? Well, now we know why.